when a national bank becomes the victim. It's May 12th, 2026. Welcome to yes2hellwith.com. Today we examine something extremely important. What happens when the government accepts the narrative of a major national financial institution without independently challenging the structure beneath it? That is exactly what occurred in the case against Orlando Carter. Now understand carefully, banks possess enormous institutional credibility. Jurors trust banks. Investigators trust banks. Prosecutors trust banks. Courts often presume banks maintain accurate records. And once a bank identifies itself as the victim, that designation carries tremendous weight. But under the Liberty Dialogue's framework, no institution is supposed to be exempt from proof, not even banks. The question is not, what did the bank say? The question is, what can the bank prove? Now, according to what I have in my possession, major structural contradictions emerged from the outset in the Carter case, and then years later. The OCC correspondence, for example, reflects only a $250,000 obligation on file, not a $400 million loan that would be a separate transaction. And then later still, PNC Bank filed a judicial statement declaring PNC does not and never has asserted that it made a $4 million loan to Carter's company. Now think carefully about what that means. Because if the bank itself later states that it never asserted the existence of the alleged $4 million loan, then what exactly were the FBI and DOJ prosecuting? This becomes one of the central questions of the entire series. The OCC, which oversees national banks, as I said, shows a $250,000 debt, which occurred years earlier than the accusation of the much larger loan. PNC Bank later disclaimed the $4 million loan, as we know by now, and authenticated records prove the obligation never existed. Now, this is where the public must slow down, because this series is not claiming that every bank irregularity proves innocence. The issue is far more structural. The issue is whether investigators and prosecutors independently verify the alleged obligation before transforming it into a major federal criminal case. Now, the verification by the FBI and the DOJ, I will say it plainly, never occurred. Neither agency did a thorough and competent forensic investigation of PNC's allegation. Had they done so, Carter would never have been convicted. In fact, there never would have been an indictment. Now here is where the danger becomes obvious. Once the FBI accepts the bank's narrative, then prosecutors inherit that narrative. And once prosecutors inherit that narrative, the courtroom inherits it. And then the jurors presume the underlying structure was already verified. And eventually, presumption becomes a reality for those involved. This is why institutional prestige matters, because people stop asking, was the obligation independently proven? And instead, they begin assuming surely the government already checked it. But according to later filings and the OCC, that presumption was dangerously misplaced. Now understand something else carefully. Banks are not merely private institutions. Large national banks often operate with enormous influence inside federal investigations because investigators naturally presume the bank's internal records are accurate, that its personnel are reliable, that its narratives are credible, and its representations independently create good faith. However, that presumption itself became part of the structural problem in the Carter case. The issue is no longer merely whether mistakes occurred. The issue becomes whether investigators and prosecutors allowed that very institutional prestige to substitute for independent verification. And that is one of the most dangerous things that can happen inside any justice system. Because once prestige replaces proof, the burden quietly shifts away from the government's case. And that is exactly what happened in the Orlando Carter case. In the next episode, the courtroom narrative. And we discuss how assumptions become official history once they enter the record. And as always, may truth reign supreme.